his book, Eunoia, is an experiment with each chapter is written with words that have only one vowel. It's sort of vowel constraints, shall we say. And of course, this project that he's going to take some time to tell you about today involves man inserting DNA into bacterium and bacterium spitting out a poetic response. You know, it may sound like an episode from a J.J. Abrams science fiction TV series, but this is the lit version of it. So I can do no better than to pass you over to Christian to take you through this and to bring you into a rather wild and wonderful world. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to introduce you to a project that I've been working on now for more than 14 years, and it is still incomplete. It's entitled the Xenotext. The Xenotext is pretentious enough to actually have two epigraphs here for you. Not one epigraph, two epigraphs. The first is by F.T. Marinetti from his Technical Manifesto of Futurist Literature, where he says, "There is also a microbe essential to the vitality of art." And I'd like to talk to you about this microbe. Now, I've paired this quote with another one from Prince Philip of England, as reported by Dutch Press Agentur in August 1988. And of course, Prince Philip of England says, "In the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus." The Xenotext is a kind of experiment, a literary exercise that explores the aesthetic potential of genetics in the modern milieu, doing so in order to make literal the renowned aphorism of William S. Burroughs, who has declared that the word is now a virus. My experiment proposes to address some of the sociological implications of biotechnology by manufacturing what I call a xenotext, a beautiful, anomalous poem whose alien words might subsist like a harmless parasite inside the cell of another life form. Now, I've composed my own example of living poetry so that when translated into a gene and then integrated into the cell, the text nevertheless gets expressed by the organism, which in response to this grafted genetic sequence begins to manufacture a viable benign protein, one that, according to the original chemical alphabet, is itself yet another text. I am, in effect, engineering a primitive bacterium so that it becomes not only a durable archive for storing a poem, but also an operant machine for writing a poem. Let me introduce you to one of my oldest friends. This is Dinococcus radiodurans, and it is the proposed symbiote for my xenotext, in part because this extremophile can repair its DNA so quickly that the germ resists mutation. It does not change or evolve very easily. Scorch it, freeze it, wither it, and still it endures. It can survive exposure to the vacuum of outer space. It can withstand dosages of gamma rays 1,000 times more lethal than the dosage needed to obliterate a human being. It is widely regarded as one of the most unkillable things ever to grace the planet Earth. And a few biologists, including Anatoly K. Pavlov and others, have even gone so far as to argue that the ancestor of this organism must be at least partially extraterrestrial in origin to have acquired all of these immunities, because there is in fact no environment on the planet Earth that might drive its evolution. Now, because there exists a codependent biochemical relationship between any preliminary genetic sequence and its resulting protein sequence of amino acids, my two poems must likewise be bijective in their structure. And what do I mean by this? Imagine pairing off all the letters of the alphabet so that they are mutually assigned to each other. So that, for example, if I assign the letter N to the letter D, I have to assign the letter D to the letter N, etc. Do this knowing that there exist 7,905,853,580,625 possibilities for such encipherments. Pick one of them. Pick one of these 8 trillion ciphers. Now, write an eloquent poem such that if we replace every single letter with its counterpart from this code, we get yet another eloquent poem. It took me 4 years to write these 2 poems that are on this slide. I worked on nothing else for 4 years. I had to teach myself computer programming skills in order to build the tools necessary for me to explore these 8 trillion ciphers. After nearly 4 years of failure trying to write 2 intelligible texts according to this very burdensome constraint, I have nevertheless made the prerequisite breakthrough, and here is the evidence of it for you. The poem on the left is by me, and it is the poem that gets enciphered as a genetic sequence. I have nicknamed the poem on the left Orpheus. The poem on the right is the poem that the organism creates in response to the genetic sequence as an enciphered protein. And the poem on the right is nicknamed Eurydice. I'll perform these 2 poems for you. The poem on the left, Orpheus, reads, "Any style of life is prim. Oh, stay, my lyre, with wily ploys moan the riff of any tune aloud, moan now my fate. In fate we rely. My myth now is the word of life." Now the organism reads this poem, and in response it produces the poem on the right, which I have called Eurydice. And it reads, "The fairy is rosy of glow. In fate we rely. Moan more grief with any loss. Any loss is the achy trick. With him we stay. Oh, stay, my lyre. We wean him of any milk. Any milk is rosy." Now, what freaks people out when they look at these 2 poems is that if you look, for example, on the poem on the left, wherever you see an A in the poem on the left, you will see a T in the poem on the right. And wherever you see a T in the poem on the left, you'll see an A in the poem on the right. Wherever you see an N in the poem on the left, you'll see an H in the poem on the right. And wherever you see an H in the poem on the left, you'll see an N on the poem of the right. The 2 poems are mutually enciphered and perfectly transposable. The text on the left is written by me as a masculine assertion about the aesthetic creation of life, while the text on the right is written by the microbe as a feminine refutation about the woebegone absence of life. The 2 poems resemble Petrarchan sonnets in dialogue with each other, much like poems written in the elegiac pastoral tradition of the herd boy and the nymphette. Moreover, the protein that enciphers the poem by the microbe has been chemically tagged so as to make the cell glow red in the dark. The microbe is in effect going to fluoresce rubescently, redly, in a fey way that embodies the rosiness attributed to the fairy described within the content of the poem itself. The poem that the organism writes discusses the fact that it glows red in the dark, and the poem that it creates causes the organism to actually glow red in the dark. That is, in fact, how you know the organism is writing the poem. You just have to look at it, and if it's glowing red, you know it is writing the poem in response. All right, this image may be difficult to see. On the 31st of March, 2011, my lab at the University of Calgary confirmed that the gene XP13 caused a colony of E. coli to fluoresce red in our test runs, implying that when implanted into the genome of this bacterium, my poem caused the cell to write its own poem in response. However, later tests showed that the protein was only half as massive as expected, implying that the germ was censoring my poem, destroying it during expression. I had, in fact, engineered not the first microbial writer, but the first microbial critic. Yes, I suppose that's true. Now, on October 3rd, 2012, after months of failed assays to correct this problem, I finally received confirmation from the lab at DNA 2.0 that my revised genetic cipher, gene XP13-4A, did cause its culture of E. coli to fluoresce properly without destroying the poetic matter of the poem. So I can now say that I'm the first person in history to design a microorganism capable of writing a meaningful text in response to an enciphered gene. Now, I've since collaborated with a lab at the University of Wyoming in order to implant this gene into Deinococcus radiodurans. I mean, my project would be over if I had simply promised to get any old microbe to write a poem. But I promised too much. The dark blot in the second lane in this image signals the presence of the poem in E. coli. That particular big dark blot in the left lane on the, is in fact the protein being produced by the organism. This particular image is in fact the backbone of the resulting protein after 2 femtoseconds of folding. The long chain of amino acids, much like a bike chain made of magnets, begins to fold up into a bundle, and here you're actually looking at a computerized simulation of that fold. The image depicts what the poem is expected to look like at the atomic level in the cell. And of course, I built it as a model. This image depicts the molecular embodiment of the Xenotext as a kind of sculptural translation of the poem itself, a model made out of toy molecules for exhibit in a gallery. And this particular model has been shown at numerous galleries in North America and in Europe. Now, on October 31st, Halloween 2013, after months of detailed planning, I received word from my lab at the University of Wyoming that the implantation of the Xenotext into Deinococcus radiodurans had achieved 2 of my 3 benchmarks for success. First, the organism had fully integrated the plasmid for the gene into its chromosome, meaning that the gene would endure in the cell. Second, the organism was fluorescing red in response to the gene, meaning that the cell was constructing the protein according to our expectations. The technicians, however, could not detect the full mass of the protein, arguing that the organism was metabolizing the construct too quickly for their methods of detection. This would be tantamount to sending a fax straight to the shredder before you have an opportunity to read it. Nevertheless, the scientists thought they were conveying good news about my success when, of course, these results implied that, as in the case of the failed assays for E. coli, the extremophile was destroying the poetic matter of the text before we could read it, meaning that no one could, of course, verify the poetic merits of the microbe. And I have since been working hard to figure out how to correct this particular problem so that I can redo the experiment. And this picture depicts the failed sample of my synthetic bacterium. Priority 1, this little slide from the movie Alien. Ensure return of organism for analysis, all other considerations secondary, crew expendable. This is really how I felt about the failure of this project. Alas, I found out this result on the very last day of my funding, when all the budgetary contracts expired, exhausting all my resources and all my expertise. I had spent more than $120,000 Canadian over the course of 5 years on this project, only to fail after a photo finish, stalling out within sight of my finish lines, bereft of any hypotheses about the reasons for this failure. Consequently, I have now set out to raise even more funds to rebuild my team so that I can resolve these issues in the hope of making the poem work. Had I simply promised to create a microbe with the capacity both to store a poem and to write a poem, as was the case definitively for my successful experiment with E. coli, I would undoubtedly be among the most famous living poets of the century. I could perhaps be the most famous poet of the century, but right now I guess I have to settle for just being in the top 5. But alas, I have in my hubris promised too much, exceeding the ambition of putting a chimp into orbit so that I can instead put a chimp on the moon. I have been working hard to ensure that as an act of conceptual literature, this project does not simply exist in thought alone. Okay, let me conclude here for you. The Xenotext ultimately infects the language of genetics with the poetic vectors of its own discourse, doing so in order to show that through the use of such biological emissaries, we might transmit messages across stellar distances or even epochal intervals. Unlike any other cultural artifact so far produced, except perhaps for the Pioneer probes or the Voyager probes, my poem, stored inside the genome of a bacterium, might testify to our presence upon the planet until the very hour when at last the sun itself explodes. I am striving, in effect, to produce an immortal artifact in the face of our own extinction. Even now, a copy of the poem has hitched a ride aboard not only the OSIRIS-REx probe en route to the asteroid Bennu, and here you see a certificate validating the fact that it is a part of the payload aboard that probe, but it is also currently orbiting Mars aboard the MAVEN probe. Moreover, a radio telescope at the Jamesburg Earth Station in Carmel, California, has even beamed a copy of the Xenotext to the exoplanet Gliese 526 in the constellation Boötes as part of a plan to communicate with any civilization that might reside on this allegedly habitable world orbiting in the Goldilocks zone of its red dwarf star. As you can see, I am in effect striving to create an imaginary solution to many of the requisite problems that poetry faces on the eve of its own demise. When people tell me that poetry is dead, my response is to build an unkillable poem. Of course, this demise is already upstaged in advance by other cultural concerns more epic than any poem. Now, I have produced a book entitled The Xenotext Book 1. This is the first half of the project. I describe this as the Orphic volume. The subsequent book, I hope, will be the Eurydicean volume, if I'm successful with this experiment. But I've been working now for 14 years, and as a consequence, I've not published anything in the interim. So I've had to put out a book just to remind people that I exist as a poet. What I'd like to do for you now is perform the opening salvo from this work. This is a poem entitled The Late Heavy Bombardment. Welcome, wraith and reader, to the Hadean aeon of the earth, when myrmidons hurled their cobalt bombs into your molten world of basalt and bronze, when mighty golems swan dove from orbit to drive their glaives of iron into your black mesas, only to be engulfed by the blast waves. When meteors fell earthward in droves, each one a gigaton warhead ablaze. When supervolcanoes erupted, flamivomus after each hammer blow. From these endless blitzes of aerolites and firebombs, when bolides of brimstone collided, then exploded into ablative cascades, when tsunamis of lava like napalm bedrowned a subcontinent in a deluge of flames, when millions of Molotov cocktails shattered all at once upon the cobblestones of hell, when Trojans berserk with rage stormed over the brink of your abyss, vowing to claw your face from the skull of the moon. What dire seed must these onslaughts have scattered like shrapnel across your cremated badlands? What prion, what virus, what breed of spore must have emerged like a spear point or a sword blade from these early ovens of Auschwitz, each cyanide bonfire burning in reverse, spitting forth a fitful embryo cloned from the smoke and the dross? What orchid must have bloomed among the flamethrowers in the furnace? What dragon must have hatched from a burnt geode buried in these ashes? Must the universe be so pitiless as to immolate all its offspring at birth? Even now, the astronauts have marshaled their forces to march resolute across the kill zone of your God-forsaken crematorium. Even now they forge ahead onward through war games of wildfire, unaware that far away a doomsayer murmurs prayers against them from a fiendish grimoire. What howl can beckon from the benthic fathoms of your damnation, so alien a ghoul as Vampiro toothus infernalis, the vampire squid from hell, a maw that can hurl itself at your soul like an overcloak cast upon a coat hook in the dark? What does such a black brain afloat in its vat of ink know about the death blows to your planet? What does such an emissary think about the pageant of living things that go extinct en route to your incinerators? The trilobites, the nautilites, the gorgosaurs, the pterosaurs, the iguanodons, the megalodons, all of them massacred but unmourned. All the deepest seas have withered and soured. All the tallest Alps have crumbled and burned. You have choked on miasmas of methane. You have upturned all your braziers, spilling embers across the flagstones. All your fossils have dissolved in a flash flood of acid rain. What great comet has yet to plummet from the heavens like a rocket engine dousing its jets during splashdown in your oceans of nitroglycerin? What thunderclap has yet to herald the advent of this plowshare which can bulldoze a mountain into rubble upon impact? What matchheads, when scraped against your atmosphere, can ignite its oxygen, turning the sky into a blazing typhoon? Only a demigod like 99942 Apophis can offer you this apocalypse by becoming the juggernaut that smashes through the massive bulwark of your bedrock. Only destroyers like 2102 Tantalus or 4179 Tatus can erase all earthlings with the ease of suicide bombers at a marketplace. Can an oyster in its shell survive the inferno of free fall from outer space? Can a crocus thrive in soil made from pulverized meteorites? All hail, hail, bop, and every super bomb yet to detonate. What great dying must the earth foresee in the barren mirror of the moon? What fate, what fury, what muse must gaze upon the grim face of grief reflected in your silver shield, a faceplate of bulletproof glass, pitted and strewn with scars? What cinders aflame disintegrate in your gray seas of nectar, of vapor, of crisis? What shell shock must greet you when you stumble aghast upon the charred remains of a forest at Tunguska, its evergreens toppled and blasted, all of them split like matchsticks? What crater among the lunar Maria must you yearn to recreate whenever you vaporize an atoll? Even now, your battalions of astronauts stride across green plains of Trinitite to storm the walls of Castle Bravo and Castle Romeo. Even now, Neil Armstrong returns like Orpheus to the airlock, his spacesuit reeking of gunpowder and burnt steel. What American falconer must aviate your spy plane by the stray light of meteor storms from the Draconids or the Scorpiids, the flak raining down like glitter dust upon the desert during a nocturnal firefight? What scythe blades must the Vikings forge from the wreckage of an asteroid recovered from Cape York? What archangel must the martyrs placate when they kiss the black stone of the Kaaba at Mecca during the Hajj? What sunburst must erupt like Krakatoa over the Arctic Circle when the firepower of your payload exceeds by tenfold all the dynamite exploded during World War II? Even now, the President of the United States sits alone at night, dreading the grim hour when he must open the memo from his aide, only to read upon the page the single phrase, "Pinnacle Nuke Flash," the news flash that chronicles the omnicide of the world. What global threat of Sturm und Drang must your armies yet endure, even in their granite bunkers deep beneath the massif of Cheyenne Mountain, when every fountain of hellfire in the firmament can destroy you? When a K-dwarf star like Gliese 710 can plow through the Oort cloud, bombarding the earth with cometoids that shatter every landmass. When a Wolf-Rayet star like WR104 can outshine the galaxy in a burst of gamma rays so bright, the blaze must burn away the ozone layer. When the sun itself can bloat, then flare to engulf you in a flaming embrace that atomizes the iron core of your planet. Even now, your astronauts are running out of air while they writhe inside their blazing coffins. Even now, you must despair, for you have listened to the throb of the universe, yet you do not hear the cries of any other souls in hell. Tell me, Wraith and Reader, tell me, will love save us from our fear that we are here alone? What then if we peer into the sky at night, but see no distant lantern blinking at us from the far end of the cosmos? What if such a beacon goes unnoticed, like a dying flame in the darkness? What if only the most wicked people in the world, the pharaohs, the warlocks, the assassins, ever get to read this signal from outer space? What if the message, when decoded, says nothing but a single phrase repeated? We despise you. We despise you. What if we find the evidence for such hate embedded in our genomes? Even now, colonies of dark ants from a species called Mysterium Shadow feed themselves upon the blood of their young. Even now, my love, these words confess to you that the universe, without you in it, is but a merciless explosion. Come with me and let me show you how to break my heart.
All right, so I mean, one of the questions has just been, and there'll be plenty of time. I know all of you sitting out there, you've got plenty of questions. Keep them handy. I'm going to turn this over to you very soon. But one of the questions, I suppose, listening to you perform that piece that is so communicative and so performative and that speaks so much, and then thinking about this bacterium with its protein sequence, which essentially most of us are unable to read or to understand unless it's translated somehow to us. If we think of writing as communication, right, who is the Xenotext communicating to or with?
Well, I'm not writing this poem for the intelligent raccoons that might inherit the planet Earth a million years from now. Nor am I necessarily writing it for the aliens that might park their spacecraft in our orbit a billion years from now. I'm actually writing this poem for my fellow poets in the 21st century. I'm doing my best to scare my friends and rivals. To make their lives...
Scared. Right there, I'm shivering. Yep. Yeah.
I'm trying to make their lives more difficult. Now, there are lots of ways in which an alien civilization, perhaps a billion years from now, might be able to look upon this organism and notice that it in fact is an artificial construct, recognizing that it is in fact the product of a sentient civilization that has preceded them and their arrival here at the Earth. It's tantamount to spray painting graffiti on an obelisk in the desert, leaving behind a hieroglyph that nobody can decipher, yet provides evidence for the presence of somebody having been there. And that's all, in fact, we might need to do in order to be able to signal our presence as a sentient culture to any aliens who might deign to read this project sometime in the future.
And yet your piece suggests, right at the end, that being able to understand the message is important, right? Because what if it says, they decipher it as we despise you, right? I mean, we might. I mean, who knows when we... Yeah.
Yes, I mean, we always imagine in science fiction that the message from outer space is going to be an expression of fraternal goodwill across the universe, right? And I think it would be quite distressing to discover that, in fact, aliens look upon the rest of living civilizations as an affront to their existence. That particular poem is a way of thinking about the origins of life on the Earth. The late heavy bombardment refers to a period in terrestrial history when the Earth was being formed, being bombarded with asteroids and meteorites from outer space. It was a hellish environment, and yet it coincides with the origins of life on this planet. Life appears at that moment when the Earth itself is at its most hellish. It appears almost instantaneously during this bombardment. And to me, testifies to the incredible versatility of life, the ability to survive under extreme duress, to, in effect, I think, transform hellish environments into paradises. The fact that our planet is as beautiful as it is now and as habitable, as favorable to our existence as it is now, is really the product of organisms transforming the terrestrial environment so radically that it is no longer the hellish environment that was inhospitable to life. And of course, the entire universe itself, so far as we can tell, is completely devoid of life. Everywhere we look, we see no evidence of its presence. So it's something of a miraculous occurrence, so far as we know, for it to appear on this planet. And it is still subject to all of the threats that the cosmos can throw at it. There are all kinds of horrific fates that await the planet in our near or distant future. And it is still an open question whether or not life is adequate to solve these problems. The dinosaurs, for example, have disappeared in part because they didn't have a space program. And they were incapable of deflecting an asteroid that destroyed their world. And they were on the planet for hundreds of millions of years, much longer than we've been on the planet, and they still couldn't solve their problems that the cosmos proposed to them. So I think it's important, given our fragility as a species, to actually find some way of preserving our cultural legacy over epochal time, because so far as we know, we're the only sentient culture that exists in the universe. And that makes us especially valuable, and what we know about the universe especially important to preserve.
And are you hopeful about that? I noticed that you nicknamed your poem Orpheus, and the response is Eurydice. But if we know the Orpheus story, I mean, it suggests that it's unsuccessful, right? Because he turned around, she went back down to Hades. You know, he loses the gal, right? Is this a sense of sort of doom there, or are you hopeful about the message actually being able to be preserved and passed along?
It's true that the book of poetry is riven with lots of hellish overtones. It's got an apocalyptic note to it for sure. A lot of heartbreak. The book is full of hell and heartbreak. It's a sad book, very mournful in tone. It's kind of unexpected that I think would have written this book in this manner. I didn't expect it to be so dark in its tone. But the work itself is responding to our own potential threats of extinction that face us over the course of the next century. I think that I'm actually very optimistic about our future on the planet, more so than many of my friends who are naysayers of the species, suggesting that our outlook is very pessimistic. But we've had three periods in our past history as a species on this planet when we in fact were far closer to going extinct. There are 3 occasions in our past when there were fewer than 10,000 of us on this planet. And we know this by looking at the genetic heritage of our species, and we can detect that there are in fact 3 bottlenecks that we pass through. We've never come so close to extinction except on those 3 occasions in our deep past. Right now there are of course 7 billion of us on the planet, and that suggests that we're a highly successful species. When my friends are curious about this fact, saying, obviously there's too many of us, I always joke, well, how many transistors would you like on your computer motherboard? 10,000 transistors or 7 billion? Which one is faster and smarter? Which one has at its disposal greater computing power? The fact that we have 7 billion of us on this planet means that there are 7 billion minds that can be mobilized to solve all of our future problems, and if not those minds, at least their shoulders can be recruited to lean into the wheel. That means that we have far more minds that, and far more bodies that can assist in solving these problems. Now, obviously, you know, when you have too many transistors on a circuit board, the circuit board might overheat. That seems to be happening right now on the planet Earth. There are too many circuits, and we're overheating. But I think that all of the sociological and technological solutions to our current crises are actually available to us, and that we will figure out how to muddle through this crisis, hopefully going on to become a spacefaring civilization that does not have all of its eggs in one basket. I think that you know, our outlook is actually very promising compared to every other creature that has ever evolved on this planet. On a footnote, I will simply remark that I was born in 1966, and my first memory that I can actually date is the moon landing. And for me, that is probably the most important evolutionary moment of all life forms on this planet. The very fact that one life form deliberately set foot on an extraterrestrial world is a major achievement for life on this planet. I think that the time in which we live is tantamount to being alive at the very moment when one lungfish crawls out of a tide pool and hops across the land to another tide pool. The first moment when aquatic creatures become terrestrial. I think that we're entering into a newer phase of our own evolutionary development in which we escape the gravity well of the Earth. And that's an important development. It means that we have a greater prospect of escaping many of the crises that face us if we can actually develop that technological capacity to explore other worlds and improve our ability to manage this one.
Well, on that note, I'll let you guys know that I will be opening up for questions and
or concerns.
There will be a mic that'll be going around, I think, and you think about it. But just before I open it up, you can't leave us on a cliffhanger. You've got to let us know what are the next steps, and you're trying to get the Xenotext experiment completed, right? And then after that, I'll take questions, right? Yeah.
Well, I'm of course still trying to raise money to continue with the experiment. I have enough funds to try maybe once or twice more. Each of these experiments takes about 6 months to develop and fabricate and design. I have to do all the genetic engineering, proteomic engineering, computer simulations myself. The scientists can make things for me and they can test things for me, but they won't do any of the research and they won't troubleshoot the problems. I have to figure out how to revise the experiment to provide success.
And do you know what is the key?
We have no idea. Genetic engineering is a young science. This organism is very difficult to engineer. The scientists are already very impressed that I've managed to do as much as I have, given my expertise. There's a bit of magic or voodoo at play in trying to figure out why the construct fails, even though it has successfully worked in E. coli. And I don't have an adequate hypothesis. I've spent the last year and a half doing more research in an effort to come up with a usable hypothesis that would permit me to redesign the experiment in a meaningful way. Otherwise, I'm just groping around in the dark. And every experiment costs a little more than $10,000 to complete and 6 months worth of work. So I can't screw up too frequently because it's expensive and time consuming. All right, I'm happy to handle any questions or concerns that you might have in the audience. Please do not hesitate to put up your hand.
Yeah. Just put up your hand.
I apologize if I've overwhelmed you.
Yeah. There we go, right there.
I thought about Bill Viola's video, The Morning Glory, that keeps opening and keeps opening. And I felt the intensity, as you were reading, I felt the intensity of what you're bringing across, and so much otherworldly factors and so much epic themes come in. But I have a very related but earthly question. I'd like to find out, I mean, all this work, can you tell us what your other hobbies are?
So what are my other hobbies?
Do you have time for any other hobbies?
I have the very good fortune of doing something for a living that I would also do in my spare time. I get to be a poet. And it's really a great job being a poet because you get to work indoors and you get to drink on the job. And there's not a lot of jobs where you can do that. You know, like I can only think of two, like brain surgeon and air traffic controller. Right? Being a poet is great. It's about all I ever do if I have free time. I sit down and read poetry or write it. I'm thinking about this particular project quite constantly, of course. I have been for 14 years. I'm of course curious about other academic concerns, and as you can see, I have a lay interest in science, and I keep the pace with developments in science. I'm very interested in science fiction, for example, or in contemporary developments in a handful of hobby horse interests. But I have to admit that otherwise I'm a one-dimensional person. I really am a poet at heart and take pleasure in poetry in my spare time. I mean, going to work is like going to the playground every day. I mean, occasionally some older kids come by on BMX bikes and beat me up, but you know, right, most of the time it's actually a lot of fun, right, to go to work.
Other questions? Yes, right in front here.
I just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the future of the human race?
Whoa!
What are my thoughts about the future of the human race? I thought I underlined that I'm actually an optimist. I think that our prospects are very good for our future. Now, there are, of course, lots of concerns of environmental concerns that are quite obvious to us now. But of course, there are also other future concerns around development of really game-changing technologies like artificial intelligence, commonplace genetic engineering, and nanotechnology. I mean, these three sciences converging in this century will mean that we're granted an enormous amount of power. All of us will, in fact, have at our disposal truly godlike capabilities in the next 50 to 100 years. And we are not prepared necessarily for these advancements. We are probably at the very moment when we're wiping out, you know, most of the species on the planet in a great sixth extinction, at the same time creating a new ecology of mechanical and cybernetic life forms that may transplant us. And that's a worrisome concern, I think, for a lot of scientists and engineers, that even as we're, you know, wiping out many species, we're at the same time creating new ones to displace us. And I think that you know, these are cause for concern. But as I said, we have a lot of brains and a lot of bodies at our disposal to deal with these issues. And the long-term trends in our history as a species suggest that we're in fact better off than we have ever been in our collective welfare, that there's probably no better time to be alive and be a human being than now. I mean, if I had my choice, I would say I'd want to be a human being sometime in the future, because surely it's getting only better for most of us. I mean, of course, there are lots of people still living in dire poverty, enduring suffering, having to contend with military conflict and unnecessary stupidity in the world. But This is not the general condition of the species as a whole, and certainly as a percentage of our numbers, most of us have actually gotten to enjoy a greater degree of liberty and self-governance than ever before. So that's an optimistic, assessment of our future.
Right in front of you.
So do you feel that optimistic about the future of poetry?
Well, I'm less optimistic about the future of poetry, of course, in part because poetry has become that one art form to which you are demoted, because you're pretty much incompetent at everything else in life. It's still a field that doesn't require much training in order to become a member of its college and of practitioners. I mean, if I was up here and performed music very badly, I think there might be some objection, right? Some of you might even throw tomatoes at me or something, right? I mean, we usually boo people who are bad at stuff like that. Whereas it's very difficult to do so, at least in the poetry world of North America. People sit through the most boring stuff politely. They do so and enduring it with much aplomb in a manner which I think would be difficult to conscience in any other specialization, in any other art form. Which is not to say that that there's not a future for poetry. It's just that poets have become, I think, very complacent about their position in the world. Failure, for example, is presumed among poets, and in fact lauded and celebrated and justified, otherwise provided with many excuses. Many of my friends have suggested that if I fail at this project, that would be even more interesting than my success. And my joke in response to that is that failure is always more interesting to the spectator. It's never interesting to the person participating. I mean, when you watch ABC Wild World of Sports and you see that ski jumper going off the edge of the ski jump, flying through the air and ending in a kind of yard sale of broken bones right at the end, right? We think that's fabulous, don't we? Right? It's spectacular, flame out. But from the viewpoint of that poor ski jumper, failure is not an option. And I feel like that I want to be a poet who does not have to presume that failure is a viable option. Moreover,
is part of the problem that there are sort of no yardsticks, I suppose, and so in fact poetry is a field that almost insulates itself against failure, which then means that there is no success as well, right?
Well, there are lots of yardsticks when you look back at the history of the tradition. I mean, poetry used to found civilizations, right? Poetry was written in holy books and in sacred texts that were communicated orally and provided the cultural foundations for entire civilizations. Moreover, I'll revert back to my anecdotes about the moon landing. It's been almost 50 years since that great achievement, and yet there are no canonical, significant, meaningful poems about that event. And you can bet that the ancient Greeks, if they had rowed a trireme to the moon, there'd be a 12-volume epic about it, right? And of course, the 12-volume epic that we have, is just a story about a kidnapped fishwife being retrieved, right? I mean, you could imagine that there would be an even better, epic poem with mythic events, intercontinental battles, and extraterrestrial voyages that are true, not just mythical, but are in fact true. Poets do not write about it. So if you're a young poet, I would tell you that you actually have, unskied snow. You have at your disposal an entire, virgin milieu if you decide to write the great epic poem about the moon landing. And of course, it's not just that. I mean, nuclear weapons exploding in the mid-20th century, 2 great wars, none of them have actually got attached to them great epic poems. Even though there are robots currently taking pictures with cameras of ethane lakes, orange ethane lakes on Titan, a truly surreal landscape that you could not concoct from your own imagination, but it is a real place. Poets are not writing about that surreal landscape. They're writing about their divorces. And I don't understand that. I mean, I find that a bit mystifying because there's a lot of poems about divorces, and I just think you should be bored of those poems by now, right? Right, when there are all these magical experiences that you could write about that nobody has addressed so far. I mean, that you have your perfect opportunity to do something original.
So So not a fan of emo. Yeah, at the back, Kai Chai. Oh, you've
hi,
got your own mic. You brought your own mic
No,
with
I
you.
got it, I got it.
Oh, that's what you get. That's what you get for being the director. You know, like he has his own personal mic.
No.
It's
I got
a
it
very
in hand, so that's
LKY
fine.
moment. Yep.
Hi, Christian. I did a Proust questionnaire for the journal that I'm editing, QRS, and I asked you a question about a movie, the kind of movie that you want to watch. At the movies, if you had to pick a comedy, a tragedy, or an action thriller to watch, which will you go for and why? And you say, I choose science fiction. And the answer is because no matter how poor the storytelling might be, there is always at least one scene that depicts a surreal, oniric vista inspiring to the imagination. So I have a very facetious question. What sci-fi film you have seen lately, The Martian, Interstellar, or any other film that you have seen, which scene in one of those films that is inspiring to you?
Oh, well, I probably can't speak immediately to films I've recently seen.
Because no hobbies.
Because no hobbies.
Okay.
I think a better story would be to say that one of my favorite science fiction films is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I saw when I was 10 years old, long after it had been released in the movie theaters. It had in fact been re-released, and I watched it as a young child. And that film has many scenes, many vignettes within it that have become kind of tarot cards in my own life. The scene of the black monolith standing on the deserts of Nairobi has always been haunting to me. The story, the story recounting the death of HAL 9000, the crazed supercomputer, has always been very important to me. I mean, I was once asked, which character from fiction would you most want to meet? And I said HAL 9000. I would most want to meet a super intelligent computer. Those scenes from a movie that is, of course, based upon grandeur and a kind of great cosmic sense of wonder, I think are important moments. My favorite science fiction film, historically, when people ask me what it must be, my favorite film, I always say Blade Runner. And again, it's because of the beautiful architectural vistas and the wonderment of that particular world that has created a very integrated, carefully crafted depiction of a future that seemed all too plausible in the early 80s when I first saw it. So I point to those two films as having special significance to me. Offhand, I can't think of a really great science fiction film that I've seen recently. The Mad Max film is, of course, quite wonderful, and I have to say that the vistas in that are quite excellent. Certainly, the firestorm, the glorious chase scene through the sandstorms are. I mean, I think that's probably my favorite part of the movie. Certainly, that appeals to me, I think. Okay. We probably have just a couple of minutes left for one very short question.
Hi, yeah. Well, I recently read from New Yorker about Kenneth Goldsmith, and then I read about the fact that you and another poet drove from Toronto, is that true? And had a drink, and then that's how conceptual poetry, came about. So I would like to kind of know more about that event, and then how does this whole thing start? So you can talk about that.
Sure, I'll do that.
The significance of alcohol in creation, always very interesting.
For those of you who may not know, I'm one of the founders of a global school of poetry called Conceptualism. I'm one of its three founders. Kenneth Goldsmith, poet from New York, is probably our ringleader, the great admiral aboard our pirate ship. And I read a book by him when I was very young called Number 111, which is an encyclopedic list of words that rhyme with the sound R. And it lists them all in alphabetical order, starting with one-syllable words. R, bar, car, far, right, etc. Then it does two-syllable words, right? And then three-syllable words. By the time you get to 3 syllables or 4 syllables, you're now involved in phraseology. the bride stripped bare, the comfy chair, etc. Like you proceed through a whole list of rhymes. I read this book and promptly wanted to meet the man who wrote it. And he was doing a reading at Buffalo, at SUNY Buffalo, a university there, for a reading series called Wednesdays at 4. And it is a short drive from Toronto to cross the border into America and visit Buffalo. And we did so in one winter when he was a young poet reading there so that we could meet him. My friend Darren Werschler and I drove down there. And sure enough, after the reading, we introduced ourselves, expressed our gratitude for his work, flattered him immensely, and he decided that we were the two coolest guys in the room, and he blew off the rest of the evening and joined us for drinks at a bar in this basement in Buffalo during a blizzard. And we hung out at this bar and basically, toughed out this blizzard, drinking, rounds of beer, getting to know each other, and realized that we had very similar attitudes about poetry and its potential futures as a discipline. And as a consequence, we decided at that moment that we should collaborate and create a school of writing, a school of poetry with its own set of aesthetic agendas. It was only until a few years later that it was actually named. We ended up being called the Conceptualists. We've acquired numerous participants now in that movement, and it has become a very famous, I suppose, school of writing. At that event, we were sitting there, and in our enthusiasm, we said, if we can actually pull this off, someday one of us might actually get to address the President of the United States, or maybe even become a bestseller. And in fact, both those things happened 10 years later. Kenny ended up performing poetry for the President of the United States. He read traffic reports to the President of the United States. And my own book, my last book, went on to become a worldwide best-selling work of poetry that went on to win the Griffin Prize, the most valuable prize for poetry in the world. Now, neither of us, of course, ever imagined that these two events might come true, but at that reading, at that time at the bar, we bizarrely had that oracular recognition that we might someday become important. Thank you for the question. I imagine that we have now overstayed our welcome.
I think we are just about to end exactly on time.
I'm relieved to hear that.
Yeah, and I will sort of thank our sponsors, obviously the Arts House here, of the venue partner, and of course the National Arts Council for having made this possible. I know that we could hang around forever listening to Christian, and I encourage all of you to go downstairs for the book signing.
Yes, please buy books.
Buy his books and all. And it just leaves me to thank Christian for this wonderful session. I believe that today you've probably gained quite a few supporters that help bump you up from number 5 to number 1 in the poet rankings.
That's very gracious of you to say so. I appreciate that.
We look forward to hearing about that and to hearing about how the Xenotext experiment goes on and succeeds. All right.
Thank you for your indulgence. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you.